Okay. All right. Are we going live here? Got my hat on. All right. I'm just going to give it a second to let people join in, and then we will start. So let's see. We'll just see if anyone is coming on in, and we'll give it a go. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So let me make sure that this live is working here. And let's see. It should be working. All right. Let me check on it. Sorry, I'm just going to give it another second here. Okay, all right. I think the live is actually working, and let's give it a go here. All right, so welcome to the Mary Monroe Christmas edition of the Curator chat, and I'm going to do something really cool this time around, and I think you're going to like it. So what I want to do is something that's really fascinating about the time period of James Monroe and the early Republic is that our holiday traditions, not just Christmas, but a lot of our holiday traditions were just starting to form. We're just starting to solidify. And we were starting to find our own voice for our holiday traditions, our own sort of unique American voice. And that was sort of personified by a wonderful poem. And it was published in 1823 by our friend Clement C. Moore, and it's called A Visit from St. Nicholas. And as we know it as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. Something that I want to do is something that's really interesting about this poem, about this, is that not only was it sort of the beginning of our modern thinking of Santa Claus and sort of Christmas traditions and that sort of thing. Hey Rob, how are you? Merry Christmas. So not the sort of the traditions of that sort of thing. But it also has a lot of really cool sort of historic cues and clues within the story itself that gives sort of a callback and an idea of the Christmas traditions and what they were doing back then. And so it's sort of a story within a story. And it's really kind of fascinating. And so what I want to do is I'm going to read through, let's look at this story through a historic lens and see the historic story within the story of 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, or A Visit from St. Nicholas. So I'm going to read it through, and let's go through the clues. Let's check it out. All right, ready? 'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. Stockings. All right, what's the deal with stockings? What's going on with that? Well, interesting thing about stockings, the tradition of stockings hanging up by the chimney, is that there's really not a solid smoking gun clue as to where that tradition comes from. There's various sort of legends and stories about where it comes from. We know it's European, we know it was passed down, we know it's fairly early. One of the sort of the most prominent traditions goes back to the original stories of St. Nicholas himself. And St. Nicholas, at one point, he wanted to help out a father and his daughter, an older man and his daughters, and he wanted to help them out. They were very poor. And so one of the things that he did was he threw bags of gold through their window, right? So he threw these bags of gold through the window, and one of the bags of gold lands in a stocking, in one of the girls' stockings. And so a lot of people think that the tradition comes from that, for hanging your stockings up. Sort of a variation of that tradition was that he threw balls of gold through the chimney or through the open window, and they landed into the girls' stockings. And so he threw them in there. Oh, hello, Santa. Yes, hi, Mike. So he threw them in there, and that actually also goes, a lot of people say that that's where the tradition of oranges, leaving 3 oranges out, which represents Santa Claus, was tied to that story. So basically the whole stockings thing, a lot of people say it comes from a story from St. Nicholas himself, where he threw bags of gold through an open window and it happens to land in the stocking. Now that's some good marksmanship right there. So that's one possibility of where that came from. All right, let's continue. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads, and Mama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. Kerchief. All right. What's the difference between a handkerchief and a kerchief? A lot of people wonder. You're obviously wondering that, you know. Well, a handkerchief is a napkin, that's used for, personal hygiene and that sort of thing. But a kerchief actually comes from, I have it right here. It comes from the French kerchief, means to cover the head. So when he's saying a kerchief, he's not talking about, a lot of people think of the vision of like a bonnet, right? That she's sleeping in a bonnet, which is something like this. But it actually wasn't. It's more of a wrap around the head, covering the head, which comes from that French word kerchief, which means cover the head. So that's what that actually, oh, from Venezuela, hello, how are you? Thank you for joining. So a lot of people, so that's actually where that comes from. The followers of the Grateful Dead weren't the first people to put, bandanas over their head and go to sleep in it. This actually dates way back in the day. And of course, Cap, he would just had something, a cap on his head. All right. When out of the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. What's he talking about? Well, back in those days, windows were all of those double sash windows, right? You had individual panes of glass. And in fact, that's kind of a good trick to look at older buildings. You can tell the older they are, the more panes of glass they're going to have. You'll have like 6 over 6. Like if you see a window with 6 panes over 6 underneath it, that means that it's a really old, old window. So he's talking about throwing up the sash of the windows and actually opening the shutters. Back then, the shutters weren't just ornamental. They actually helped keep out the wind and that sort of thing. So that's what he's talking about. All right, tore open the shutters and flew up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave a luster of midday to objects below. So that's kind of cool. Just sort of as a side note, midday is an old-fashioned way of saying noon. So he is saying, it looked like daylight. It was so bright, and we've all seen beautiful snow, and where it's sparkling and bright as day. So that's actually what he's talking about. When what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer. Okay, reindeer. Now, the first reference to reindeer was not actually in his poem. It was actually in an earlier one. It was in 1821, so it was a couple years earlier, and it was a poem called Old Santa Claus with Much Delight. And there's actually an engraving of Santa Claus. This is a couple years before, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. There's actually an engraving of Santa Claus driving a reindeer, and this was published anonymously in a book by William Gilly in 1821. So there you go. There you have it. So that's actually the first reference to reindeer. Clement Moore was not the first guy. And you guys, I'm sorry for the tangent, but I gotta read you some of this poem by William Guy that was published. This is 2 years before 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. And one of the things he says he's talking about Santa Claus, right? In this anonymous poem, published in 1821, to some I gave a pretty doll, to some a peg top or ball, no crackers, cannons, squibs, or rockets, to blow their eyes up are their pockets. So he had the foresight back then not to give dangerous fireworks to kids, so that's a good thing. Where'er I found good girls or boys, they hated quarrel, strife, and noise. I left an apple or a tart, a wooden gun or painted cart. And I love this part. No drums to stun their mother's ears, nor swords to make their sisters fear, but pretty books to store their mind with knowledge of each various kind. So he's saying he's not giving them drums to drive everyone nuts, and I know parents can relate to that. Or he's not giving them swords which to make everyone afraid. He's giving them books. And wonderful things. So, he's obviously probably not the favorite Santa Claus by the kids there. He's sort of the Sith version of Santa Claus. And I'll just read you this last line. I left a long black birchen rod, such as the dread command of God, direct a parent's hand to use, where virtue's path his sons refuse. So for the parents, he left the gift of a long black birchen rod to beat their kids with in case they were bad. So he's definitely the Sith version of Santa Claus, whereas Clement Moore's is, a little more kinder, a little more gentler. All right, so where were we? Okay. More rapid than eagles, his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. All right, so this is a little bit nerdy, but I find it interesting that he says more rapid than eagles, because eagles at this particular point in time were really solidifying as the American symbol. It was before, but especially in 1823 when he would have wrote this, eagles would have been really like the rah-rah American symbol coming out. So I just find that interesting. Maybe it's nothing, but I just find that interesting. And he whistled and shouted and then called them by name. Now Dancer, now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancin and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder, and Blitzen. Why are these names? Well, if you think about it, each one of these names has something to do with excitement or speed, right? You got Dasher, which is obvious, Dancer, Prancin. Now Vixen had a little bit of a different meaning back then. Vixen would have been a female fox, which were very fast, right? So you think of the fox hunts and everything. So he's talking about something really fast. On Comet, yes, they did know what comets were back then, so he would have had that. On Cupid, on Donder, and Blitzen. Now Donder, I don't know. I looked this up. I'm not sure where Donder, or the meaning of that, comes from. But Blitzen is an old-fashioned word for a discharge of lightning. So that's what he's talking about when he's saying Blitzen. So these are all, really powerful, fast-moving names. To the top of the porch, to the top of the wall, now dash away all, as dry leaves that before a wild hurricane fly. Yes, they did know what hurricanes were. When they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky. So up to the housetop, the coursers they flew, with a sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. When he says up to the housetop, with the coursers they flew, what is a courser? Well, a courser is a swift or spirited horse. So when he's saying up to the coursers, he's saying that these reindeer were swift and spirited. All right, St. Nicholas. All right, what's the deal with him? He's talking about St. Nicholas. Well, St. Nicholas, interestingly, there is actually our good friend Washington Irving. In 1819, he wrote a series of 5 essays in a book called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, where he talks about a wealthy British landowner who brought workers into his house to celebrate Christmas. So he's talking about egalitarian, this would have been just a few years before this poem came out. He's talking about egalitarian Christmas celebration, right? And interestingly, about a decade before then, Washington Irving, he published a history of New York, and he talks about Saint Nick, who is the patron saint of New York. And how does he describe Saint Nick? Well, he describes him with big pants, a low hat, and he smoked a pipe. So there you go. So we're starting to see Saint Nick, Saint Nicholas starting to solidify into this modern version of Saint Nicholas. All right. He was dressed all in fur, from head to his foot. Of course, fur would have been a thing then. And his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. And of course, chimneys, and we always talk about the chimneys. Chimneys would have been a prevalent thing in every person's house back then, or a lot of people's houses. And so everyone would have been familiar with ashes and soot. And a bundle of toys he flung on his pack, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. So this is interesting. So when he says peddler, nowadays we think of peddler as like a beggar or something like that. But back then, a peddler, there was a tradition of peddlers going around the country with their basically bags, and either bags or carts of goods that they would have peddled to people. So when he's talking about St. Nicholas, he's making a comparison to that sort of peddler tradition that would have been very, very prominent, which you don't read. I guess a good way to look at it would have been like door-to-door salesmen, that kind of thing. Although back then they would have just wandered around the countryside. All right, where are we here? Looking at toys and charged to have him with the pack. His eyes, how they twinkled, his dimples, how merry. His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and his beard of his chin was as white as snow. And he's breaking out the toys. All right, now toys. So people wonder, were there toys back then? What did they actually do for fun? Well, yes, they actually, believe it or not, did have toys back then. And I am going to show you a couple of these toys. Okay, so the first toy I'll show you is the bane of many people's existence, and this is called the ball and cup, right? And so what's the goal of this? The goal is to get the ball into the cup, and you can try it over and over. And I can do this all day and maybe not get it, who knows, but some people would have been good. But this is one of the toys that they would have had back in the day, and kids would have actually enjoyed them. Another toy that they had was called a bull roarer or a buzz saw, and that's what this is right here. What you do is you gather it up right here, and then you pull back and forth, and it makes a sound. Can you hear that? That's why in some circles they call it a bull roarer, because it's supposed to sound like a bull breathing right into your ear. Here, I'll be quiet for a second, see if you can hear it. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but anyway, that's what that is. And another toy that they would have had is one of my favorites. This is called the Jacob's Ladder. And this is how it works right here. It sort of goes down like this. And this is very much a toy that they would have had in James Monroe's lifetime and during the early Republic. And I know it sounds stupid, but whenever kids come visit the museum, they love these. They're not Nintendo, they're not, PS4s or Xbox or anything, but they love them. So this is something that kids would have had. And then, again, as further evidence of toys, we have this wonderful line, and I'll just say it one more time. To some I gave a pretty doll, to some a peg top or a ball. No crackers, cannons, squibs, or rockets to blow their eyes for their pockets. So yes, they had toys like they do now. Now, granted, they weren't as prevalent as they were now, and if you look at artifacts of the time period, most of the artifacts had something to do with work. But believe it or not, they did actually have Let's continue. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a reef. I wish like heck we had a pipe around here, a clay pipe, but we don't. But they're actually talking about a clay pipe like this. So I'll hold this up here. And they're very long stemmed, right? So when he's saying it encircled his head like a reef, it actually makes sense because the pipe wouldn't have been like a closer one like modern times. It would have been out like around here, so the smoke would have gone up and sort of around his head. So that actually makes a lot of sense. So he most likely would have had a long clay pipe like this. And how they did that was they just rolled clay around long thin sticks and to make the hollow inside, and then just fire it clay just like they would any other clay. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. All right. With a wink of his eye and a twist of his head, he soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. Now that line's kind of interesting because if you think about it, back then there was a lot of things to dread, right? We sort of take Santa and the concept of Santa for granted, but back then it was a little bit more of a new concept. So, and a lot of people back then believed in the Fae, and they believed in elves and things like that. So, when he says I had nothing to dread, he's not taking that for granted. It's a good line including here to show that Santa is not a threat. Because it's something we wouldn't think about now, but back then, who is this strange elf coming into my home? He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose, giving a nod up the chimney he rose. Now I found that interesting. Why on the side of the nose? Well, it's a little vague, the history of it, but there's sort of a general sense that there's a British tradition of laying the finger to the side of the nose, meaning keep it secret. This is a secret between us. So when he's doing that, it's not necessarily like a gesture of magic to lift himself up. It's more of a let's keep this between us. It's a secret gesture. So that's what he's talking about there. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim as he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night." So there you have it. So there's sort of the poem that kicked it off, right? There's the poem that kicked off the rest of the tradition. What happened after that? Well, Christmas started solidifying as a holiday tradition. The first state to actually make Christmas a official state holiday was Louisiana, believe it or not. In 1837, they actually made a state holiday. And then it became only a national holiday in 1870. So it wasn't until the 1870s where Christmas was, sort of really came into its true modern form, I think, And we talk about Christmas traditions, Christmas decorations, everything was very sparse. You didn't have these massive light displays, like you do now. As far as the Christmas tradition is its ancient origins, that's a topic for another time. But you got to think of Christmas as kind of forming in this era from a sort of nebulous idea of celebration to an actual really firm tradition, and it was in James Monroe's time period that really started happening. I'm going to talk about one more thing, and I want to talk about it because it has something to do with James Monroe's time period. And this is the tradition of the New Year's Eve ball. And I'm going to talk about it. In 1904, Alfred Ochs, he actually was the owner of the Times. He dropped a 700-pound light ball in Times Square. And the reason he did that, the reason they dropped that ball, is actually has a tradition to, I think it's 1827, if I'm not mistaken, 1827 or 1821, where the British, in the 1820s, the British Navy started dropping time balls out into their ships to synchronize time. And so that's where that tradition actually comes from. So it actually comes from centuries earlier during James Monroe's time period. So that's where the New Year's Eve ball comes from. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in, and I really appreciate you listening. Have a wonderful, happy holidays, and a wonderful Christmas, and we will see you next time. Merry Christmas, everyone.